When analyzing a story, it is worth recognizing that nothing stands alone. Individual scenes are defined by the preceding context and are then used to inform future events. In this sense, context is king, and the quality of a story can be judged by the execution of the scene given cause and effect. One type of media that has a particularly difficult time with this idea is the adaptation. Adaptations largely require change. Reasons for this range from necessity due to a shift in medium to the new iteration having a different vision. Yet while new media must create their scenes from scratch, adaptations can and often do pull their scenes from a source material that will have a different context. An interesting example of this effect is Tomb Raider 2018. Tomb Raider 2018 is a film based on the first two titles of Crystal Dynamics' recent Tomb Raider reboot, Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise of the Tomb Raider. For games to pull from, these titles have different enough plots that it would be unreasonable to faithfully adapt both in any competent manner. In response, this film faithfully adapts neither, opting instead to pull information from both titles and compile it into a whole new thing. Yet despite the dramatic differences in characterization and the plot, some things are carried over more faithfully than others, and as such, comparing the games to the movie would be a study in why things were to begin with and why they had to change. To start, let's compare their versions of Lara Croft and her story. In Tomb Raider 2013, Lara Croft is an English archaeologist who is also fresh out of college. With her mother dying when she was an infant and her father dying when she was a child, she became fairly isolated and introverted, apparently. Something she never had was a positive relationship with her father. Richard Croft was established to become obsessed with the supernatural following the death of his wife, and as such grew neglectful of his daughter, while Laura, despite her age, became disillusioned with his ramblings of the paranormal.
In his last years, he was obsessed with myths about immortality. Of course, no one believed him, including me.
While she followed in his footsteps and became an archaeologist, she also wants to distance herself from him in the beginning.
They were dressed like the Storm Guard, and the sounds they made almost inhuman. Shit, just listen to yourself, Lara. You sound like Dad. It's like they're the remnants of some lost civilization. Okay, now I really sound like Dad.
Another critical piece of her background in the games is her relationship with Conrad Roth. Roth was the right-hand man / super best friend to Richard Croft before he died, and saw to raising his daughter in his memory.
Lara, I'm sorry. I got you into this mess. I made a promise to your father. The last time I saw him, I swore I would look after you, keep you out of trouble. And what did I do? I put you right in the thick of it. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I loved you like the daughter I never had. I'm proud of you.
Described as Laura's mentor and father figure in supplementary material, he's the kind of person who has the Tomb Raider skill set already and saw fit to train her upon taking her in.
Let's see if this thing still works. Just remember Roth's training. Thank God for Roth's training. All those treks, all those climbs. It's as if he'd been preparing me for something like this all along. Roth always said I must have gotten my sharp eyes and steady hands from Mum. That summer, he taught me to shoot instead. I took to it. Maybe too well.
The game requires gameplay, and this background justifies her capacity to perform. Her various advanced survivalist skills along with weapons training is contextualized in this manner. The general premise of the first game is a fish-out-of-water scenario. Lara stumbles into the happenings of the cursed island and is forced to survive. While she's better equipped to handle the scenario than a blank slate, she lacks the temperament or experience in a sense. Throughout the game, she is constantly torn down, both physically and emotionally, being forced to push forward through sheer force of will. By the end, she's adapted to the struggle and shows glimpses of what she will become in time. This evolution is demonstrated in the gameplay alongside the story. Lara's combat abilities are limited heavily in the beginning, as she hasn't developed the demeanor for combat at that stage yet. She lacks a damaging melee attack, having a non-damaging shove until later. Her stealth kills decrease in time and effort as she progresses, and general animations like climbing change slowly over time to show more efficiency as she uses these skills. For whatever reason, Lara is also very talkative. When the enemies yell at her, she will occasionally yell back.
Not a chance, you bastard. That's right! Run, you bastard! I'm coming for you all!
The nature of her in-game dialogue changes with her character. Early combat in the game is very quiet from Lara's side, as her general fear of the situation is barely overtaken by her will to survive. As the game progresses, she becomes more outspoken and brash, turning from timid and unsure at the beginning to more assertive, cold, and violent by the end. In the movie, she is a little different from her game counterpart. Mother died as an infant, I guess, and her father, Richard Croft, left her at an early age, presumably dying. When the movie starts, we find she's a mail courier who's broke. This begrudges another character because she could have access to a large inheritance, but refuses to comply due to a stubborn persistence that her father might still be alive. Upon some reflection, she swallows her pride and brings herself to sign some documents until she gets a video game-like clue to her father's activity, ultimately resulting in the overlying plot. Lara demonstrates some characteristics she didn't have in the games. She interacts explicitly with more characters in a casual way, showing total comfort working with effectively strangers, which knocks out potential introversion. She's sentimental like the games, but lacks the sort of cognitive dissonance she holds with that sentimentality, as she not only had a good relationship with her father, but it is that relationship that is the core motivating factor for her to get involved in the plot. A frustrating change they gave her was the removal of all training. Lara never went to college for training in archaeology, and there is no counterpart to the character of Roth.
You know what, Dad? I didn't go to university.
She is shown to be fairly clever and physically adept, with fighting being a hobby for her, but anything advanced past that point simply isn't justified, which isn't that big of an issue, as she never acts too far beyond this basic skill set. The most interesting example of this is her skill in archery. Because it's a thing in the games, Lara uses a bow. I'm not entirely sure the character she took the bow from knows how to use it, but whatever, she gets a bow. Where Roth taught her in the games, here she sort of just knows how because she's practiced as a child, apparently. This information is established in a single flashback scene earlier on that largely exists to establish this skill. Lara never uses a gun, not that she would know how to. She demonstrates very proficient physical prowess, such as the scene where she climbs a rock wall with a notable hole in her gut, but she has nowhere near the advanced skills of her game counterpart. This Lara also goes through a lot less struggle, for a lack of a better term. The premise of the story is not a baptism by fire. Though she does stumble into the plot in a sense, she is more actively seeking it out, and what she is shown to survive is simultaneously more and less believable, leaving her in a much better physical state by the end. The general arc she goes on revolves more around finding herself, I guess, initially resolving the conflict of her father walking out at the beginning to taking up a new role by the end. Moving on with the other characters. Richard Croft is not a prominent character in the games. He dies long before the events of Tomb Raider 2013, and his influences on characters are shown almost incidentally rather than having any significance to events whatsoever.
You've got great instincts, girl. You just have to trust them.
That's what my father used to say.
Now, there was a man that ran on instinct. For better or worse. He would have been so proud of you, Lara.
This changes somewhat by the end of the game, where after Lara has encountered mystical nonsense, she comes to recognize that her father's obsession could have validity, which leads into the events of the following game.
I've been so blind, so naive. For years, I resented my father, doubted him like the rest. But he was right about so much. I just wish I could tell him that now.
Rise of the Tomb Raider is about her following up on some work of her father's, which gets her involved with the plot. She is motivated by a sense of guilt for the relationship she had with him, and the only development she seems to get on this front is when she accidentally learns how he died.
Wait! Trinity killed your father!
No.
The movie develops the character a lot further than the games do, a lot of which comes down to him being an active character. He leaves at the beginning of the movie to pursue hunting some supposed mystical nonsense, but then gets hung up on that ordeal opposing the enemy faction. Lara doesn't know about his obsession with the supernatural until she finds a video and documents about that. Upon their first meeting on the island, he ignores her, believing Lara to be hallucination.
It's not real. Ignore it. It'll go away. It always does.
The man has been isolated for decades, and it has made him go insane, so naturally he gets over it pretty fast. They have a few scenes, say a few words, but ultimately have the eventual falling out scene from Lara not destroying his research like he requested, thus allowing the villain faction to pursue the supposed mystical nonsense.
Himiko's curse will be unleashed on the world.
Dad, listen.
You coming here was a mistake.
He pops up later, sort of just around for the rest, until the end where he helps stop the retrieval of said mystical nonsense and then blows himself up. He says his goodbyes with Lara and brings finality to her arc involving him, and that's about it. There is no clear parallel for this Richard Croft to the games, as he serves a different role. The closest you can find is Roth, and that is for being a father figure that died and not much else. Despite how important they make Richard in this movie, he doesn't really do much on screen, and his death is a self-sacrifice, primarily centered around the main conflict, and doesn't invoke a strong reaction from Lara at the time because she's busy. If you compare this to Roth, which you probably shouldn't, the man is constantly acting, saves Lara's life on multiple occasions, and dies by a self-sacrifice move that may or may not have been necessary to protect Lara, invoking a significant response from her that lasts time skips. Different priorities, I guess. The supporting cast between the two are completely different. The general plot lines of the games and the movies are separate enough to justify no shared names or roles. The last group adapted is the main enemy faction. In Tomb Raider 2013, the main enemy faction is known as the Solari, a group of deranged cultists following their leader named Matthias. The overall goal of this group is to escape the cursed island via means to be discussed later. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, a new faction was presented, named Trinity. This group basically serves as the Tomb Raider version of the Illuminati, an organization that wants to rule the world or something using mystical nonsense. This group is alluded to in 2013 as basically an Easter egg. They pop up more than you might expect, but they are only recognized outright in 2 documents in the game, one of which is the reward for finding all the collectibles, sort of, and is basically there to set up the sequel.
I was sent here to investigate a new threat to Trinity's interests on this island. When I arrived, I discovered Matthias and his Solari cult. I believed then that Matthias could never acquire the star phenomenon. But I was wrong.
The leaders of Trinity in Rise are named Anna and Constantine, the former appearing in the movie as well in an extremely accurate depiction given the context of the overall story, that being Richard Croft's ex-girlfriend and quasi-mother figure for Lara, who is secretly evil. Something you may recognize is that the factions described are distinct with different objectives. In fact, the Solari were in direct opposition to Trinity by how they operated. You may be wondering how the movie handles this, and the answer is it deletes the Solari. The main villain faction is Trinity, the super-secret Illuminati of this universe, who have a tale of mystical nonsense on a small island and want to grab it. because that's what they do. The main villain of this movie is Matthias.
My name is Matthias, local.
Because that's the name of the villain from 2013. Due to changes in the story, he now works for Trinity as a sort of private contractor. He's still insane because of course he is, but the most noteworthy difference is he doesn't believe in the tales of mystical nonsense.
See? Smoke and mirrors. Alright, let's bag her up.
He has a job to do assigned to him and he can't leave until it's done. Basically a totally new character created by the merging of the source material. Now, let's compare the plots. While pulling information from both 2013 and Rise, the movie's plot shares the most with 2013. Here's what happens in the game. Laura is part of an archaeological expedition for the lost island of Yamatai, and unfortunately for her, they find it. The ship she's on is crashed via means elaborated on later, ultimately leaving her stranded on said island and initially separated from the rest of the crew. The primary goal is to survive, the method of which evolves from amassing food and warmth to calling out for help via radio. You will occasionally meet up with other characters from the expedition and run up against the Solari and Matthias, thereby who seem to have a fixation on another character present. Throughout the story there will be references to the Sun Queen Himiko and the phrase "no one leaves."
No one leaves. That's what I heard in Japanese before the plane crashed.
The background of the island is that it was the home place to a supernatural being known as Himiko. The legend of Queen Himiko is the basis of the expedition and reveals itself to be true over the course of the story. Himiko was, at a time, a type of god, possessing nondescript powers like weather manipulation, and most importantly the capacity to extend her life by transferring her soul via ritual. Naturally, she was evil, so in a previous ritual, the priestess didn't put up with it and killed herself mid-transfer.
I have no choice now but to meet my fate. Tonight, I climb the stairs to the Chamber of the Sun, but I will never submit to the ritual. I will not emerge queen. For the sake of Yamatai and all the priestesses that would follow me, I must die.
The result was her soul trapped in a decaying body. The lingering effect of this was a curse on the island that would kill anyone who attempted to escape, ergo, no one leaves. A couple other effects of this event were apparently screwing up the weather patterns of the island and creating an undead warrior group somehow. The primary motivation of the villain group is to undo this curse and escape by resurrecting the Sun Queen via a soul transfer ritual, since they worship her apparently. Laura resolves this issue by torching the corpse. The latter half of the game is largely spent in relation to the villains wanting to set up the ritual, and Laura piecing together this information leading to the climax. There are some specifics left off, largely dealing with pushing Laura's development, but for the most part, that's what we're dealing with. The movie is primarily adapted from this storyline, but it tries to be subversive in its adaptation. Right at the beginning, the movie establishes Himiko as a powerful sorceress who was betrayed by her own generals and dragged off to Yamatai. This tale is eventually unearthed and piques the attention of Trinity in taking whatever Himiko had and using it as a weapon. Richard Croft darts off to try and stop them, leading to the events of the movie. After Lara begins to sign her father's declaration of death, because that's a thing she needs to sign apparently, she is given a video game-like clue as to the activities of her father, leading her to find his secret vault of probably illegal stuff, and his notes on Himiko. Taking those notes as a clue to what Richard was doing when he disappeared, she tracked down the ship he supposedly contracted, which leads her to tracking down Yamatai. From there, the ship crashes all of the game, and Laura wakes up to Trinity searching the island for Himiko's tomb, and moving out now that they have Richard's notes on the subject. They attempt to make Laura and her ship captain friend work slaves instead of just killing them for some reason. Stuff happens, and Laura escapes. Amongst other events working up past this point, she encounters her father, who is still alive somehow, goes back to camp to steal their satellite phone to call for a way off the island, and manages to start a revolt with the slaves, until she encounters the tomb's entrance, and both she and Richard get forced to go into the tomb by Matthias. After encountering a couple Last Crusade-like challenge rooms that, weirdly enough, have nothing to do with any of the puzzles in the game somehow, they encounter Himiko's tomb, which provides contradicting information to her myth.
Something doesn't add up. She's not a monster in any of these paintings.
It is at this point that it clearly states outright there is no mystical nonsense. There are no supernatural powers at play in this movie. Himiko allowed herself to be buried in this tomb because she was an asymptomatic carrier of a zombie virus, and therefore anyone she touched would become an undead ghoul in a matter of seconds. The people of her time interpreted this as magic.
They thought it was magic. She was a carrier.
But she was immune.
At this point, the threat changes and it becomes Laura and Richard stopping Matthias from delivering a bioweapon to the Illuminati. In the fight, Richard gets infected, dies along with the entire villain team, and Laura barely escapes. The slave revolution hijacks a helicopter off the island, and the movie ends with Laura realizing that her quasi-mother figure was secretly working with Trinity the whole time because she was adapted basically one-to-one for some reason, and choosing to take up her father's role, fighting her by tomb raiding or something. This story is a very strange adaptation of the source material. In a certain sense, it's almost an inversion of it. The game starts with Laura not believing in magic only to encounter it face to face and having that experience change her view of her father. Meanwhile, the tale of Himiko starts out as a tale of benevolence, ultimately to reveal her as evil. In the movie, Laura's almost apathetic to the potential of magic, only finding out about it effectively after the fact and dismissing it out of hand only to be proven right as an option that wasn't initially on the table is brought up and the threat is changed. Himiko is presented at the beginning as basically the god of death, ultimately shown to be a tragic story of a girl who allowed herself to be killed to prevent the spread of a disease. No mystical powers whatsoever. If you know the source material, it's definitely subversive, but an issue the movie doesn't seem to realize is a lot of the other stuff it pulls from the game wasn't changed to accommodate. The phrase "no one leaves" pops up a lot in 2013, and rightfully so. Not only is there a curse that destroys any vessels trying to leave, but the spirit of Himiko will then pop up and say as much while it happens. In the scene where the ship crashes in 2018, you can still hear the spirit of Himiko, yet because there is no curse, it is nothing but a red herring of an Easter egg. Both Matthias and Richard outright reference this line, but must contextualize it via other rationales.
The only person that I get to talk to is on the other end of this phone. And they always say the same thing. I can't go home until my work on the island is done.
But I realized she never let me leave.
What are you talking about? Who's she?
Himiko.
The removal of the curse also influences the story structure. Whereas in the game the ship crashed because of the curse, the ship still crashes in the movie, it just happens to be the case that the waters were that bad, and continue to be, ruling out a boat escape. The movie is full of things from the game, copy-pasted with little to no accommodation. One example of this, Laura has a jade necklace. In the games, the origin to this necklace is 10 seconds of dialogue in a larger scene.
I've studied them so much, I can see charts on the back of my eyelids. But if I'm not right about Yamatai being in the Dragon's Triangle...
I remember when you found that on one of your father's digs. You ran up and showed it to me dressed in your penguin pajamas.
I was 5 years old. It was my first find.
Afterwards, it never gets referenced. In the movie, this necklace has a whole dedicated scene, all to itself, about how critically, vitally important it is that it lasts a minute, and then 10 minutes later in the movie, she sells it for money somehow. They simultaneously made it more and less important. Now, let's break down why she was selling it. Well, she needed the money to pursue her dad, ignoring the whole she was in her dad's secret vault one scene ago, and could have found something in there like another artifact or stored cash. Then you break it down even further and it becomes how she's willing to give up the pendant but not sign the declaration of death as an indication of her character and priorities. Yet past these reasons, you hit the recognition that this scene exists because it was a thing in the game but wasn't dedicated to it, so it was written out. Another example of a thing that was brought in randomly, the climbing axe. In the games, Laura uses climbing axes to climb rock walls and eventually incorporates it into combat. In the movie, it's absent up until the climax where they need to fight the villain, and as such, there is just a climbing axe in the room for Lara to grab. One of the goons, only one of them by the way, brought down one single climbing axe into the tomb and put it down on a table to let the climax happen as it does. Another thing that carries over, Lara's arm injury. In 2013, very early on in the game, Lara is scraped in the arm by a fire arrow of all things. This leaves a bloody wound on her until later where she is equipped to treat wounds and bandages it up during a time skip. In 2018, although it is never pointed out by any character, Lara receives the same bandage on the arm as she did in the game. Yet she's never shot at by any arrows in this movie. During the ship crash scene, she cuts open her arm and Trinity takes the liberty of bandaging her up after knocking her out because they're nice like that, I guess. You lose the self-reliance of the original and make the behavior of the enemy faction random, given how psychotic they are shown later, all because this was a thing in the game. To close off this comparison, let's look at 3 particular scenes. Over the course of the whole movie, there are 3 scenes that are directly adapted from 2013. The ship crash, the airplane wreckage, and the first kill. The faithfulness of the shots range between them, but the core concept of the scenes is the same to the games. Starting out with the ship crash, this scene is largely shot for shot from the game. Jumping off the ship, landing in the water, swimming up to the coast and getting knocked out by a goon, the context is different in a few ways. For one, there is no curse knocking off the ship, but more prominently is the change of characters, as since the movie excised most of them, their parts in the sequence is effectively gone. An even more faithful scene is the airplane wreckage. Lara washes up from a river to the remains of a fallen airplane. The glass of the window to the plane starts breaking, forcing her to grab a parachute before falling out. From the parachute, she has a bad landing that leaves her injured. The difference with the movie is this scene is more played out. There are a couple more steps in the chain, and the steps that are common between the two have slight differences that somehow make the movie version less believable to survive. It is also worth noting that while in the movie she gets stabbed in the gut because of this, and gets medical attention later, in the game she doesn't receive a new wound, but rather an older wound which should have killed her anyways, gets reopened and heavily cripples her, requiring the wound to be cauterized. The final adapted scene is the first kill. This is a famously criticized scene in the games and is the loosest adaptation of the three. In 2013, the first major encounter with the Solari results in Laura being bound and the other crew members in the area executed. Laura manages to escape somewhat because the Solari are incompetent and is found by a single man who proceeds to demonstrate why they didn't kill her immediately, resulting in a fight where Laura kills him.
Oh, God!
Laura has a bad response to having killed a man and then sucks herself up, picks up his weapon, and moves on. A minute later, she mercilessly guns down some goons. This scene is famous in discussions on ludonarrative dissonance. The argument being that she doesn't demonstrate the remorse of the first kill in the later encounters because the gameplay requires that to be the case, creating a break between the story and the gameplay. Given the totality of her character arc with regards to combat as discussed earlier, alongside the game's insistence that the strongest aspect of her character is her survival instinct, obnoxiously conveyed at times, I personally don't find the shift all that unreasonable, however fast it may be, especially as this is nowhere near the worst aspect of the narrative. In the movie, she escaped the Trinity camp, and for whatever reason, they sent a grand total of one person to grab her. They fight, and because the rating of the movie is lower than the game, instead of shooting him, she drowns him slowly as you're shown the life leave his body. From that point, it hangs on the shot, and she has a negative reaction before having her attention redirected to something else. Her reaction is a lot more subdued than the game, some of that coming down to it being so dark that you can barely tell what's happening. She has a lot of time past that point before she ever re-enters combat, and because it isn't a video game, doesn't have that significant of a kill count anyways. It's less rushed than the game, but it's less logical too. And that's it. That's all I got. Something I wonder about Tomb Raider 2018 is if knowledge of the game improves the experience or not. It takes enough liberties to definitely be its own thing, but the heavy inclusion of game stuff is probably very strange to someone unfamiliar with the source material. What must they think when they hear an ominous Japanese voice during the crash that turns out to be nothing? What must they think of the constant references to no one leaves when there is no reason why you can't? Would they find the importance of the necklace weird? Would things just seem off? Whereas if you know what they're adapting, would you think twice about it? It's a strange thought that I wanted to share with you.